Welcome, everyone. My name is Nick Valesky, and I work for our Utah State University Extension Integrated Pest Management Program. And I'm the one that's coordinating these vegetable IPM winter webinar series. And this year's series will be geared towards Utah's commercial and small urban farmers, along with a lot of home gardeners too. So we got a lot of great information for everyone. And then tonight, our webinar is going to specifically cover common diseases and insects of root crops that are grown here on our Utah farms. So this can include our carrots, parsnips, radish, rutabagas, turnips, and beets. And as a reminder, you guys are watching this on a Zoom webinar, so you will not have access to your camera or microphone. However, please leave us comments and questions in the Zoom chat box. And when you do that, make sure you're sending the message to everyone. So all the panelists, hosts, and attendees. So that way we can all see your question and learn from it. And this webinar is being recorded. So I'm going to have this posted on our USU Extension YouTube channel tomorrow, along with our USU Extension Pest website. And if you requested a pesticide use CEU for your Utah Department of Agriculture and Food pesticide applicator license renewal, I'll have questions for that at the end of this webinar, and I'll talk more about that at the end of it. So now I'm going to give the time over to my colleague, Kaylin Taylor. He is our Millard County Agriculture, Horticulture, and Natural Resource Extension Agent. And he's going to talk to us about some insect pests.
There we go. So just a bit of an overview. Like Nick said, I'm the county extension agent in Millard County here. I will say I won't call myself an entomologist, but hopefully I can guide us through this pretty good here. So the things that we're going to go over today are mainly the life history, the damage, and then some of the control methods for some common root vegetable pests here in Utah. So we're going to talk about aphids, beet armyworms, a couple different types of cutworms, carrot rust flies, beet leaf miners, and then pale-striped flea beetles. We're going to start out with the aphids. So first I'm going to cover the willow carrot aphids. And they're about 1 millimeter long, so obviously pretty small since they're aphids, and their bodies are going to appear a little bit waxy colored, kind of like they've been dusted with like a light wax. So they overwinter as eggs on woody hosts, and then during the summer you're going to find them pretty much all over your vegetables. The next one that I want to talk about just real quick is the black bean aphids. So they're a dark green to black color. And then you'll notice in this picture, especially the top one here, that they're kind of a dull black color. They're not shiny. If they're shiny, you have cowpea aphids, and those are a little bit different. So these also overwinter as eggs in the cracks of bark on euonymus and viburnum plants, which are like your burning bush, honeysuckle, those types of woody, usually ornamental plants that we have. So they'll hatch in the spring, and they produce 1 or 2 generation of wingless aphids, and then there's going to be their 3rd generation will be winged females, which are going to migrate to your root crops in your gardens like carrots, celery, parsnip, and they'll even go to like weeds like lamb's quarter and curly dock, and then they'll go back to their hosts, which was again like honeysuckle or burning bush, and that's where they're going to lay their eggs. The last one is the green peach aphid. So these are kind of pear-shaped, and they also overwinter as eggs, usually on peach, nectarine, and plum trees. So the nymphs that develop into winged adults are usually kind of pinkish colored, which I like on this bottom picture of the green peach aphids. You can kind of see the pinkish ones. Those are the ones that are going to turn into the winged adults. And the populations of these are going to usually peak on your vegetables in July and August. A note on the eggs for all of these species, they'll be slightly different colored, but they basically all start out a little bit green, and then they're going to turn black later in the stage of eggs. So that's a little bit about aphids. And you'll notice on most of these pictures, they're on the underside of leaves. So that's a great place to scout and look for aphids. Some of the damage that they cause, they've got, well, they'll feed on pretty much anything, the buds, the leaves, the flowers, the stems. They're not super picky that way. They've got a piercing, sucking mouth part, so that's sort of how they do their damage when they're feeding. And I like this bottom picture here because you can see that the leaves are curling. That's a sign that you've got a lot of aphids. And as that leaf curls, it kind of turns into like a protection from them. So it makes it harder to get them with insecticides. It makes it harder for predators to get them, and it protects them from the weather a little bit. So that's something to look for as well. While they can damage plants when they feed, obviously, but I think your biggest concern here is the viruses that they can vector and bring in. So beet yellow virus is going to be one. You can see it really does a number on these beet greens here. And then they'll also vector in mosaic viruses. They're going to cause you a lot of problems as well. So yes, they can cause problems. And I mean, this will obviously stunt growth and ruin your greens when they're feeding, but it's also generally of more concern the viruses that they're going to bring in. And then a couple ways to control aphids. I sort of mentioned scouting frequently is going to be really important, and their numbers can increase really, really quickly. So when you're scouting, you want to make sure and be thorough. Flip over the leaves, take a look on the underside, and then monitor all the sections of your crops to make sure that you're not missing any, because if you miss a small colony of them, their numbers are going to boom quick. Some cultural things that you can do is when you're transplanting things to maybe a different section of a greenhouse or a field or your garden, make sure that you're inspecting the transplants before you move them, because you don't want to go introduce aphids to a new section. Remove weeds, like I mentioned, lamb's quarter and curly dock are some that they'll kind of tend to be on a lot. So you're going to want to remove those from the areas that are close by your garden so that they don't cause you any problems later on. Avoid excess fertilization. Aphids love extremely vigorous plants. So anytime you're over fertilizing or using too much nitrogen, you're going to tend to have more problems with aphids. Some biological control. I will say with biological control, it can be extremely effective, but usually it's in small areas. So if you've got like a big field, it's not going to do you a ton of good to go release thousands of ladybugs or lacewings or anything else out there. It's pretty enjoyable, but they're just going to fly off and leave. So they can be effective in small areas though, or greenhouses. So keep that in mind. As far as chemical controls go, aphids are pretty prone to developing resistance, so make sure you're cycling your different classes of insecticides. One of the most effective things you can do is treat the woody host with insecticidal soaps or horticultural oils. And that's just gonna, basically what the soaps and oils do is suffocates them. And that's a great way to take care of them early in the season, right after they hatch. And then your conventional sprays and insecticides they'll kill aphids. You've just got to be a little careful with them because they'll also get rid of your pollinators and your lady beetles and lacewings and everything else, because they're just traditional insecticides. So that's a couple of ways that you can work to control your aphids. The next thing I wanted to cover is the beet armyworm. In southern Utah, the armyworms are gonna overwinter as the pupae, which, you know, like inside of the chrysalis, like on that third picture here. And they'll just overwinter in the soil, and then they'll come out as the moths in the spring. The females will lay a few hundred eggs on the underside of leaves, or on like branch tips of woody hosts. Eggs will hatch in 2 to 5 days, and then you'll have the caterpillars. They'll feed for about 3 weeks, and then they'll go into a pupa, and they'll pupate for about 5 to 8 days during the summer. So several generations can occur every year, as they just keep reproducing and growing. And then the moths have a wingspan of about an inch. The worms themselves are about an inch long, and the pupa are about half an inch. So that's kind of how you can recognize them. Something kind of interesting about these is in northern Utah, the pupa cannot survive the cold winter, so the moths are reintroduced from southern locations every year, and then they'll lay their eggs up there and have a couple generations in northern Utah as well. The damage that beet armyworms can cause is a concern for pretty much any vegetable, notably beets. They'll really just shred the leaves and destroy them. And then as they cause their damage, that can cause stunted growth as well. But if you've got an extreme problem with armyworms, they can pretty much defoliate an entire plant. And there have been areas in Utah, I've seen pictures, I've never seen it myself, but you'll just see like an insane amount of these things just coming across areas, and they'll destroy things really quickly if they're that bad. So while we're on worms, I want to cover cutworms as well. We've got a couple different types. The variegated cutworms are on the left and black on the right. Just like armyworms, they overwinter as pupae in the soil, and then they'll come out as moths later in the year. So we've got the variegated moth and the black moth on the right here. These moths and worms are a little bit bigger than the armyworms. So these moths have a wingspan of about 1.5 inches, whereas the armyworm is closer to 1 inch. And then they're also a lot closer to 2 inches long as a worm or caterpillar, and the armyworm's only about 1 inch. So they also are a lot more prolific egg layers. Variegated female can lay 1,400 eggs in its lifetime, and the black ones can lay about 1,900 eggs, and they can go through a few cycles, 2 to 4 cycles in Utah a year. So these can be really prolific as well and cause lots of problems. Their damage is done mainly right at the soil level, just like their name, cutworm. They'll take a plant and just totally munch it off right at the soil and knock it over. So they're really, really hard on seedlings. And then they like to hide. So they'll kind of hide under like dirt clods or leaves during the day. And then they'll come out at night and really do their damage. So, and they'll feed on pretty much anything as well. They're not super picky, but they'll cause problems. So there's a few different ways that you can work to control armyworms and cutworms. Something you can do to help monitor your numbers is you can scout for your crops and search for the eggs and the larvae, and just look for the damage. Something else though is to set traps for the moths. So they have like pheromone traps, and these will pull the moths in, and then you can get a good idea of how many moths are in the area, and then you know how many eggs are being laid on your crop, and know if you've really got a problem with it, and then you can kind of take some control actions from there. So for maybe like home gardens, something you can do is put up a protective barrier around your young plants. I've seen people do like a tin soda can where they'll just cut the top and the bottom off and then stick that around their plant. Um, People use cardboard, wax paper, all sorts of different things. Obviously, that's not going to work on a large scale, um, but it is at least a start. End of season tilling is something that's really important because they go into the pupa stage, and then that's how they overwinter. So if you till that up, they can't survive the winter, and it'll kill them. And they're only just an inch or two below the soil usually. So when you till up the soil, that'll get them, and they'll freeze. Then black lights are another thing that's going to attract the moths, and you can kind of check on your numbers with black lights. Row covers are something that I think is really important because it basically excludes the moths from being able to come in and lay their eggs on your crop. Row covers work extremely well. They can be hard if you've got a really, really large area, but they do work really, really well if it's something that's feasible for you. So as far as biological control, there are some nematodes that will disable and kill the cutworms. And they're generally more effective in high moisture soils. But as far as I'm concerned, probably the best thing you can do is end of season tilling and then row covers if there's a way to do it. So the next thing is the carrot rust fly. So kind of similar to the moths, these will start out as eggs, then hatch into these larvae, then they'll pupate and come out as the fly. The flies look massive in this picture. Keep in mind, it's really blown up. Obviously, they're just like a regular, really small fly. So you're not going to be able to see that much detail. But the damaging stage of these is the larva. And they'll get down into the soil and start feeding on your carrots, parsnips, most root vegetables. They're happy to take a bite out of them. And you'll see 1 to 3 generations of the rust fly in Utah as well is pretty common. So this is a picture of some damages that can be caused. I really like the middle photo because you can see the size of the larva compared to like a carrot that they're wiggling around on. So all those little white spots are going to be the larva, and then you can see the holes and the problems that they're creating. The rust color is also really a good way to identify what you've got, and that's super visible on these parsnips here. You can just really see exactly where they've gone, where they've eaten, and obviously, you know, these are really damaging to these crops, especially if you're trying to sell them or market them in any way. It's going to be really difficult. So the scarring is not good. And then those areas can also become infected with different fungi and bacteria. So above the ground damage, you're not going to notice quite as much, but you will see maybe some stunted growth or some wilting in the greens of the plant. So that's kind of ways to keep an eye on the rust fly and the damage that they cause. As far as things you can do to control them, these yellow traps you can buy in a lot of different places. They're great for monitoring. They're just a sticky trap, and they'll stick to them, and then you can kind of see how many numbers you've got and figure out what you want to do. The row covers, again, with any of these flies or moths, the row covers are great because it excludes them and keeps them from laying their eggs on your crop. Something else you can do is harvest your carrots in blocks. So instead of waiting for certain ones to get ready and picking and choosing, just take a full block and pull them all up. That way they're not going to be spreading to the other ones in the area quite as much. You can also delay the planting until later in the year so that you avoid the peak egg laying period. And then try and avoid planting near like wild carrots and hemlock plants because those are alternate hosts and they like that. Crop rotations are going to help as well. And then making sure that you pull your root crops, your carrots, your parsnips at the end of the year to prevent overwintering of larvae inside of the carrot itself. And then there's also some natural enemies, but there's really, I think it's some parasitic wasps that'll target them, but there's really not too much else that you can do to target these with biological control. Granulars, as far as insecticides go, can work pretty well because you can get them down into the soil where the larvae are causing the problems. You just want to make sure that you're using something that's going to be okay around your food and stuff that you're consuming. Always be careful when you're using your insecticides. So the beet leaf miner is next. These are really small, pretty tough to see. So they'll overwinter as pupa as well, and then flies come out in April and May. And each one is going to lay about 70 egg clusters on the underside of leaves. And then the eggs hatch within 3 to 6 days. And you'll start to see the damage pretty much immediately after that. And obviously as a leaf miner, you can really see they get inside in between the layers of the leaves and just work their way around in there. You can kind of see the little tunnels and mines that they make. So the larva stage lasts 7 to 12 days. And then once they reach maturity, they'll drop into the soil, go into a pupa, and come out 10 to 20 days later as a fly. And so in Utah, we'll get 2 to 4 generations of these a year. And they'll attack beets. They'll attack pretty much any green. And like you can see on those leaves, they'll do a number of different things to cause damage, from holes to their mines, and then those will wilt, turn brittle, and break off. And then for the attached root, the damage is going to really decrease your root development. So it's really a cause for concern and something you're going to want to keep an eye on. Best thing you can do for leaf miner control is, just like everything else, inspect and scout your plants. Look for the egg masses during the growing season. Clip and remove your infested weeds, and then eliminate alternate hosts. Destroy weeds, plow, and remove crop residue. Parasitic wasps are also a natural enemy, so you can't really like release them into your area, but you can definitely encourage them with flowering plants, nectar, and pollen-rich flowers. So yarrow, dill, fennel, those are all types of things that are going to encourage parasitic wasps to visit your garden. And that's something that's really going to control your leaf miner numbers. And then again, just like with the other moths, if you cultivate the soil late in the fall, you're going to expose the pupae, and the colder temperatures are going to kill them. So then you'll get them before spring even comes. As far as insecticides go with the beet leaf miner, you can kind of make it so that the adults don't lay their eggs, but it's really hard to kill the larvae. So, and again, I would try your best to go with like a low impact type of insecticide. I'm trying to think, Spinosad's a really good one that would be effective on a lot of these pests that I've talked about so far. And that's just, it's not quite as hard on some of your other helpful bugs in the garden. So, and then if you do need to treat, the time to treat is when the eggs are hatching, and make sure that you get good coverage. So um, it's beet leaf miners. The last thing that I wanted to cover was the pale striped flea beetle. Um, these actually a little bit different than some of the others. They overwinter as adults in areas. They'll be protected by like soil clods, uh, weeds, or some different plants, and then they'll come out in mid to late spring, and then they'll lay their eggs near the host plant. And the larvae are going to move into the soil. So something else. Oh, go back real quick. Something else a little bit different is generally the larva stage is what's been like the problematic stage for most of these pests that we've talked about. But with the pale striped flea beetle, the adult stage is the one that really causes problems. So once these larvae they'll go into the soil, they'll feed on roots for about 20 days, and then they'll pupate in the soil as well, and then they'll come out as these beetles. And you'll get up to 3 generations of these will happen in Utah every year. It kind of swings from about May till September. And if these are really high in numbers, they can be pretty devastating to crops, especially younger crops. And then the larvae will feed on root crops. Like I said, their damage usually isn't as prolific as the adults, but they can still cause problems on some root crops. Last thing with flea beetles, you'll notice that they've got their name, fleas. So they've got these really long back legs, and that's kind of how they migrate. So they'll jump from crop to crop or place to place, and that's how they get places. They can really move pretty well. So you may have seen them before, and they're not they're pretty mobile. So one good way to work on the control of the flea beetle is making sure that you're planting in a good clean site. So they'll their numbers will really come out on like weedy areas, and then as soon as your crops start growing, they'll just migrate over and start feeding on your crops instead of the weeds that they were on before. So getting rid of those refuge areas along the edges of fields is going to do a lot to help control numbers. And then a trap crop can also work pretty well with the flea beetles. There's a few different ways that you can go about that. Sometimes you'll plant the trap crop like interspersed, or you can do like separate areas around your garden. Basically, the idea is that you're planting something that they like more than your root vegetable crop, and you plant it before. So the idea is to get them all to go to the other crop instead of onto your root crops. Another good thing, just like with most of the other things that can migrate and move a lot, is row covers. So those are always going to work. And then the natural enemies of the flea beetle are like parasitic wasps. There's a couple nematodes that will work on them as well. And then like lacewing larvae, lady beetles, all of those types of things. Again, with the biological control though, not usually the most effective in a big open field or even in a backyard garden, but those can work pretty well in controlled environments like a greenhouse. So I think with that.
So for this next portion of the webinar, I'm going to be covering some diseases that you may come across in your crop production here in Utah. This is not a comprehensive list, but rather just highlighting some of the more common problems that our growers see. And in all honesty, diseases aren't a huge problem here in Utah. So if you're lucky, you may not even come across any within your root crops. So like I was saying earlier, root crops are very popular and they're super easy to grow here in Utah. Whenever you go to the farmer's market, you'll see a lot of people with their fun colored carrots, parsnips, turnips, and they're really nutritious too. And they have the potential to be grown year around with the right facilities and management. However, in terms of pest pressure, that's typically only a problem in the outdoor growing season, so spring to fall. So when we talk about root crops, I categorize them as those in the Apiaceae family, so our carrots and parsnips, and then our those in Nebraska family, radish, rutabaga, and turnips. And then of course we have beets. And it's important to know that pathogens, they'll only affect specific root crop, or some of them will only affect certain root crops as opposed to others. And if that's the case, I'll let you know throughout this presentation. But in general, I'm just going to talk about these diseases and the crops as a whole. So first up, we have Cottony soft rot. This is a white mold caused by the fungus Sclerotinia sclerotorium. I don't know how good my Latin pronunciation was there, but it's a white mold that affects a wide host range of plants. So this can include a lot of succulent plants, ornamental plants, and several of our vegetable crops. And then for our root crops specifically, carrots are what get hit the hardest. Sclerotinia causes the infection during any growth stage of the carrot, and there'll be extensive root decay that'll lead to wilt and collapse of the above ground portions of the plant. And you can see that in that top right photo I have. And then the cottony white mycelium, which is kind of the visible part of the fungus, that'll appear on the infected plant tissue. And that's usually at the base of the plant, which you can also see in that top right photo. And then within the mycelium itself are these black irregular shaped structures called sclerotoria. And those are just basically hard balls of mycelium, which are all parts of the fungus. So during the late summer and early fall, the sclerotorium, it produces the sclerotoria that germinates and produces hyphae directly on the surface of inside the infected plant tissue. So the following spring, these structures, they'll produce fruiting bodies, which have thin stalks and cup-like structures. So I have a picture of that on the bottom right. And then eventually they'll release spores that are carried in the wind to other susceptible hosts to cause new infection. And that's sort of the same pattern that we'll see with a lot of our fungal species. And then the optimum conditions for this is around 60 to 70 degrees. So let's talk about managing it. So if you have a really bad infestation of it, tilling is a good option because what you're doing is you're turning over the soil and that can bury a lot of that sclerotia part of the fungus, and that can reduce the chance of disease infection the following season. Crop rotation is another good option. So rotate crops from carrots with non-susceptible crops like grains or corns, and this can help prevent that disease from building up. And then ventilation. So that just means having adequate spacing between your crops. And that can reduce the humidity in the foliage and just prevent the contact and disease spread. So think of it like social distancing for your plants. And then lastly, we have flooding. And you don't want to do this when your crop's in the field, but if you had a really rough season with the white mold, you can consider immersing the entire site underwater for several weeks, and that'll drown the sclerotia. And there are listed 2 fungicide options for our commercial growers. But again, typically this isn't a huge problem in Utah. So if you do have to consider fungicide treatment, let me know. So next up, we have powdery mildew. And I bet all of you guys have heard about powdery mildew. It's a disease that affects many of our ornamental plants, fruit trees, and vegetable crops. And you might not know this, but most powdery mildew fungal species are host specific. So specifically for carrots, it's the Erysippe heraclea is the scientific name. And then that'll affect, again, carrots, parsley, and parsnips. And then we also have Erysippe polygoni, which affects our beets. And I've actually seen it quite a bit in Box Elder County on carrots. So I don't know why that county has it the worst. But then I also have a picture of it with the beets as well. So the symptoms of both these species are a thin layer of mycelium, because remember, this is like a parasitic fungus. So it's going to have that layer of mycelium and spores on the host plant's foliage, and it's going to appear as like a white powder. That's why we call it powdery mildew. And then over time, the infected foliage will turn yellow and die off, and it can just reduce the plant's overall yield. And then the powdery mildew inoculum overwinters in the fruiting body, in the plant debris. So in the spring, when the temperatures warm to above about 70 degrees Fahrenheit and there's a lot of humidity, it'll release the spores and then it'll germinate on the host plant tissue. And then both species can grow and spread regardless of how much humidity. It just depends how the plant foliage, how much plant foliage there is and how much moisture it is. So again, the first management is you can consider planting resistant varieties. And I actually want to show you. So if you guys are like me, you get a bunch of seed catalogs in this, I'm getting them now already in January. I get like 50 of them. But if you guys are reading through them, and so like here's, oops, so I don't know if you can see that, but so like here's the carrot page. So it lists all the varieties, and if you read the descriptions, I found some that are resistant to different blights. I found some that are resistant to, or I found some beets that are resistant to powdery mildew species. So I guess as your homework, go through your seed catalogs tonight and then look up different varieties of different vegetable crops and then see what resistance options there are. So we talked about resistance and then ventilation again. So again, this is like think social distancing for the plants. So if you have them apart, that'll prevent the foliage from touching and then prevent the fungus from spreading from plant to plant. And then I also listed some fungicide options. And this might be something you want to consider since powdery mildew is super common. There are many options available. There's a lot of organic options too, such as copper-based products or sulfur-based products. And then I even found a product that uses tea tree oil. It's not something I'm familiar with, but if that's a product that you guys used in your farms, let me know about it. I'd be curious about its effectiveness. Okay, so damping off. This is a super common problem when you're working in a greenhouse. It might be a problem in the field too if your soil is really wet or infected. But basically, damping off is caused by various soil-borne pathogens such as Pythium, Phytophthora, and Rhizocotonia, and then sometimes Fusarium. But basically, the infected plants typically fail to emerge from seed or the seedlings will collapse and they'll die soon after germination. And then what happens is the stem will turn black and shrivel, and that'll prevent the water from being able to go from the roots to the leaves. And then Pythium specifically can cause some root diebacks in the carrots too later in the season. But basically, damping off, it'll occur during the times of cool and wet weather, or often like in our greenhouses, like I said. It's a soil-borne pathogen. It thrives in about 6.8 pH soil, and it overwinters in the soil too in oospores. Then it'll become active again when the soil temperature warms up. And then you want to let the soil dry out too, because the Pythium forms, it'll form like these zoospores. So when the soil is really wet, that's how it'll move around in the soil. So to manage it, I have a picture of yours truly. I'm in the greenhouse, and what I'm doing is I'm sterilizing my growing containers. So this was about a year ago, I think in last January, is I've had some water, and then I used about a 10% bleach solution, and then I soaked my black growing, we call them plugs, cells, growing trays, in that bleach water for about 20-30 minutes. And that can help kill off any potential overwintering disease from the previous season. And then if you're a greenhouse owner, I would strongly recommend deep cleaning. So there's a lot of products out there, but like do the benches, the walls, the glass, and all your containers. Good sanitation is key to disease-free production. And then in that little chart, so you can actually buy, I'll show you guys, you can buy seeds that are treated. So these ones I bought from Harris, and they're actually blue. So that's kind of cool. They're treated with something called thurium, which is like a fungicide. So when I plant these, they have some protection already. And so again, when you're reading those seed catalogs tonight, you might see if, when you read that, if the seed is treated or untreated, that means it'll be coated with something, usually like a fungicide to help prevent any disease from growing, I guess. Okay, next one, we have cavity spot. So this is caused by the fungus, or there's two different fungi that cause cavity spot. There's Pythium, I think it's called sulcatum, and then Pythium foliae. And then these pathogens favor cool temperatures, and they grow best around 58 degrees Fahrenheit. So, and they're prominently found in carrots. And what it does, or I guess they're predominantly found in carrots, but you can also find them in like alfalfa roots, celery, beets, and other host plants. So because we do have a lot of alfalfa production, a lot of those diseases. So if you're using an alfalfa field for vegetable production the next season or vice versa, a lot of those diseases can overlap. So what happens with cavity spot is it causes these oval-shaped depressed lesions along the mature carrot taproots. So you can see in that photo. And the lesions are large enough and can measure up to 1 inch in diameter. And the affections usually occur in the upper third of the root. And then both of these Pythium species occur during times of cool and wet weather, and they'll thrive in moist soils, ideally around 6.8 pH. And then the Pythium, again, like the other Pythium species we talked about, it overwinters as the oospore in the soil. And then when that soil warms up in the springtime, that's when it becomes active and can form the zoospores in the free water and cause new infection. So how do we manage it? Well, again, we can do crop rotation. So we can rotate our carrots with non-susceptible crops every few years. Avoid overhead irrigation. So I know a lot of our farmers, especially here in Utah, we do a lot of drip irrigation just because it's more sustainable, which is better for disease control as well. And then you can harvest carrots soon after maturity. So you don't want to leave them in the ground for too long because they become more susceptible as cavity rot, more susceptible to cavity rot as they mature. And then I found a few fungicide options. I listed them here. The only organic options I found were that fungi fight, which is the phosphorus acid salts, and then the Surferel biofungicide is an option. I know a lot of you guys like your organic options. So I think, yeah, so this next disease, it's called Scab. And you might be familiar with scab on our potatoes. So scab, it's caused by it's not a fungi, it's a bacterium. The bacterium Streptomyces scabies. And this pathogen, it's present in the soil, again, where potato crops are predominantly, but other root crops such as beets, turnips, parsnips, radish, and carrots can be affected by scab. So you can see the photos I have with those symptoms displayed. And it can cause a wide variety of symptoms. So on the foliage, but then, there are no above ground symptoms. So it's only on the root portions. And you can see where it has like these pitted and raised lesions. On the carrots, it's almost like a stripe. And then you can see like the black lesions on the turnip and radish as well. And then scabies causes infection when the air temperature reaches about 80 degrees Fahrenheit. And then it's kind of an unusual bacterium. It's a fun bacteria though. Like if you look at the bottom two photos I have on the left, you can see kind of the filamentous growth, which is similar to what we see with fungi. Because what these filaments do is they break off into the soil and then it can affect plants. It can affect the new plant, and then how it affects is it grows between the plant cells. So again, it's super problematic, but we don't usually see a lot of it on our root crops other than potatoes here in Utah. So for management, again, we kind of see that theme of looking for resistant cultivars that are available or cultivars that are more tolerant to scab. Here's some good advice. Always source out certified disease-free seed. So know where you're getting your seeds from. Make sure they're healthy, they're certified. You want to avoid those sketchy seed exchanges that you see on KSL or Facebook Marketplace. You want healthy plants, and you don't know where those seeds come from. They might be giving you some infected diseases that you don't want in your garden. And then lastly, I just say rotate crops. So you can implement crop rotations with your root crops like carrots, radish, turnips, and potatoes with non-susceptible crops like corn, alfalfa, and other small grains. Okay, so this next disease, this one is near and dear to my heart. The beet curly top virus. I've worked a lot with it the past 2 years. So I would say it's one of my favorite pathogens. But basically, curly top disease, it's something we hear a lot about in our tomatoes and spinach. I know I've personally preached a lot about curly top virus on our tomatoes. But beets are actually the virus's first love, hence the name beet curly top virus. And there's actually different strains of the virus, but I won't go into that. But like those strains range in severity, but it's just all like beet curly top virus. And it's actually transmitted by the beet leafhopper, which you can see in the top right photo. I actually have a beet leafhopper here on my desk that I keep in a vial. So again, I should say there's lots of leafhopper species out there, but again, the beet leafhopper is the only vector. So symptoms of curly top in our beet specifically, you'll see plant stunting, stiffness, and shortened internodes. The foliage of young plants will turn yellow and they may roll upwards with crinkled appearance. Plants infected in the seedling stage will likely die, and then older plants will eventually turn yellow and die too. In these middle photos, I have some beets where we cut them in half, and you can see that vascular discoloration. That's good, and so that's one of the symptoms of beet curly top virus in beets. So for the disease cycle, this virus, again, it's transmitted by the beet leafhopper in the late spring. So when the weeds and grass usually growing along our foothills, when those dry up, the leafhoppers will migrate towards greener plants, which are often in and near vegetable fields. And these leafhoppers, they'll probe plants indiscriminately. And to find suitable feeding hosts, they may feed on these hosts for a very short time, but then they'll move on to a new plant. So it just takes a few seconds for that beet leafhopper to taste the plant and then spread that virus. And then symptoms will usually appear within 7 to 14 days later. So when we talk about managing beet curly top virus, what we're really doing is we're managing the beet leafhoppers because they're the ones causing the problems. So it's super hard to manage, but I usually suggest planting a little bit later after that leafhopper migration. Like even that's kind of hard to determine, especially like where you live and the weather, what the weather's like that season. I think the best thing you could do is manage weeds. So you can see this diagram I made where we have our production in the middle. But if you have a lot of weeds nearby, those can serve as like a reservoir for the virus, and it can serve as like a host, alternative host for the beet leafhopper. So they can easily, when those dry up, they can easily move from those to your crops. And then another option is to use dense planting. And I know I was talking earlier about spacing them out, but with the leafhoppers, they have like really specific vision. So if you have really dense planting, it'll be hard for them to single out a specific plant. And then I know Kalen talked a lot about this in his presentation, but row covers are good for all sorts of pests. So if you put them over your susceptible crops for like the first 6 to 8 weeks of planting, they'll do a good job of excluding the leafhoppers. I know I did a whole research project the past 2 summers looking at the effectiveness of row covers to prevent the virus. And then lastly, you could consider intercropping with or trap crops. So this kind of ties back to the dense planting where leafhoppers are attracted to plants that are highly contrast with their surroundings. Okay, so these next things I'm going to talk about, these aren't actually diseases, but they're what we call abiotic conditions or biotic conditions. So they look like diseases, but they're not. So what I have here, this is called black heart or spotting. And this is an issue on beets and rutabaga. And basically the symptoms include like strapped like leaves or dark spots in the leaves. But then you can have this hard black spot on the root. So you can see in the circle, this ugly black spot on our beet. This is called the black heart. And the disorder is caused by a localized boron deficiency. So if you're familiar with soil science, boron is one of our micronutrients. And so I don't think it's a big issue in Utah, but if you have really high pH soil, that could be a problem. And I guess the obvious way to treat it is just to add some boron to your soil. But again, I don't think that's much of a problem here. But I do recommend doing a soil test for your farm, especially if you're on a large farm, do a soil test and just see what your nutrient status is from year to year. So that's blackheart. Next, everyone knows about cracking with carrots. So basically, cracking is a problem in carrots, but also parsnips and radish. Cracking occurs in the older roots and is associated with poor irrigation practices. So what you need to do is you need to keep the soil moist to ensure steady growth, especially if you have really sandy or drought sensitive soil. When the irrigation is sporadic, the roots will take in more water and then they'll expand quicker, and then that's what causes them to crack. So large rooted cultivars or the older roots are more prone to split than the small younger ones. Splitting or shattering can also occur at the harvest, especially if the soil is really cold. So that's something you got to watch out for. So this one is called forking and fanging. So again, it's not a disease. It's just kind of a growth deformity. And some people might think these carrots are cool. And again, there's nothing wrong with them. They'll still taste like carrots. But what's happening is the dense compacted soil, if that's what you have, can serve as like a root obstructions. So if there's like a lot of rocks, some factors can deflect the root growth. So when that taproot is like growing into the soil, then there's like an obstacle in the way. It'll cause like secondary root growth. So that's kind of what causes that forking, fanging in our carrots. Also, if you have like really weird fertilizer placement, that can be a factor in there too. Okay, so that was some diseases and physiological problems we have with our root crops. So now I just want to take a moment to plug some of our awesome resources. We have a brand new snazzy website launched. It is extension.usu.edu/pest. And then on this website, you can read about our Utah Plant Pest Diagnostic Lab. So if you guys are in the growing season, you find something really weird with your plants, you're not sure what it is, go ahead and send a sample to our lab and our team can help identify it. We also have a lot of educational how-to videos. We have some free guide ebooks. There's a lot of fact sheets on there. And then we'll have recorded webinar presentations. So like this one you're watching now will be archived on there. Next, if you're not already, subscribe to the Utah Pest Advisories. What these are timely email alerts on insects and diseases that you need to be looking out for. And they'll come straight to your email. We have them on fruits, vegetables, turf, and landscape crops. And then next is the Utah Vegetable Production and Pest Management Guide. This is an awesome resource. You can get the free PDF version online, and there's also the comprehensive website that goes with it. And then if you want a hard copy, we have plenty available for $20 at the extension store. So here's my contact. Follow Utah Pest on Facebook and Instagram.